Hello, my name is John Adams. I am a retired U.S. Army Brigadier General, and today I'm going to have the privilege of discussing the issue of the ongoing campus protests against Israel and for Hamas and the Palestinian cause. Um, we're joined by Jerry Gordon, who is senior editor of the New English Review. He's heard on the Jewish show on CHIN radio in Toronto. He's the vice president of Boycott Watch. He's a former U.S. Army military intelligence officer, a graduate of Boston University and Columbia University with an MBA. He's a noted international affairs and military commentator with deep knowledge of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And for the purposes of this discussion, he has intimate knowledge of Columbia University and issues surrounding the campus protests. Jerry, welcome.
Thank you, John. Indeed, it is a privilege to reverse the usual pattern that we've adopted on these interview discussions. But it's also a more serious time here in America and certainly for Israel as well. And I would imagine for world Jewry, given the explosions that have occurred in Europe and other locations with riots akin to what we have here in the US. Let me begin with kind of a précis of what's really transpired in the last 24 hours, effectively. The nearly a month encampment at one of my alum institutions, Columbia University, ended virtually in the middle of the night, Wednesday morning, on the 1st of May, appropriately, with the New York PD virtually cordoning off the surrounding campus on Morningside Heights at Columbia and essentially seizing the building back that had been obtained by protesters, if you want to call them that. They have also essentially eliminated the encampment that had been on the Low Library lawn at Columbia University. And in the process, they've arrested something in the order of about 75 individuals. It has yet to be determined how many of them, for example, may have been outsiders or provocateurs, if you will. And we'll get more into that as we go through this discussion. That was one aspect of what occurred just before May Day, and the other was out at UCLA, where there was an actual pitched battle between protesters in the encampment at that university and outsiders who came in, essentially allegedly Israel protesters, counter-protesters, if you will. And indeed, there were a number arrested at that location. Right now, the toll across the United States, incredibly, all sparked with Columbia at the epicenter, is something in the order of about 1,200 arrests. The arrests made at a number of institutions, including places like New York University, as well as in California and in Texas, indicate that there were a significant number of outsiders present that may have provoked more extreme actions of these protesters. And what are they protesting about? They want to have a ceasefire now. They basically want the Hamas brought back, quite frankly, in Gaza. And there is no notion in their mind's eye of what to do about release of the hostages. That's the eerie aspect of these protests. If they had said ceasefire now and release the hostages, that was one thing. But that was not the mantra that they were using in the press and internationally in that regard. What was also interesting was the international reaction to this stuff. Certainly, Iran, the Islamic regime in Iran, and its proxies, Hezbollah, and obviously Hamas and Houthi rebels, are applauding the actions that occurred throughout colleges here in the United States on these campuses. But the interesting aspect of this is that very few in the Sunni Arab world, in the Emirates in particular, let's exclude Qatar for a reason I'll get to in a few seconds, they have basically criticized essentially these protests because they realize all that's doing is giving essentially a voice to Hamas globally in the press. Qatar is a real problem because it has acted as a so-called neutral party in negotiations, when in fact it has been a classic supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, the Muslim Brotherhood background is essentially the genesis of what Hamas did in an extreme version of it. It is the reason why Egypt, as we both know, opposes essentially any sort of operation that would spill over Hamas and its supporters into their territory. They want no part of it. They haven't had any part of it since when, John? 1967, the end of the 1967 Six-Day War. They walked away and Israel took over. But the real problem across the United States is a fundamental one. And that is that these students, both unfortunately some token Jews and others who may represent benightedly an attempt to be humanitarians, have got the facts all wrong about who is the bad actor in this entire conflict in the Middle East at the present time. Ultimately, it's Iran. Most prominently in Gaza, it's Hamas. And Hamas has a record of using its own people as human shields, and that may account for a significant quantity of the unfortunate casualties that have occurred there. But that's not something that the press puts out there. Press is seemingly an ally in a series of propaganda operations, essentially trying to tag Israel as Nazis. It's morally, what is the expression? It's moral eversion. And that is essentially the most troubling aspect that has gone on. When you find a sitting congresswoman who herself was a supposed refugee from Somalia saying, well, I guess there are Jews who are anti-genocide and pro-genocide. Just the term of Jews being pro-genocide is basically appalling in that regard. Now, as you know, both my wife and I are Columbia alum. And there was a letter that we both signed that accounted for something close to 4,700 alumni, really expressing outrage about the anti-Semitic chants and threats of the encampment, the sideline of some Jewish faculty from admittance onto the campus, particularly at my alma mater, Mr. David Shai, as he's known, who's a professor at the graduate business school there. And it's all part of a long history at Columbia, just prior to the onset of these protests in the encampment in March of this year, was the retirement of the head of the Department of History at Columbia, Rashid Khalidi, who had been brought to Columbia in 2003 to head the Department of History and to set up the Center for Palestine Studies. That also led to the development of a separate program, Middle East Language Arts and Culture. And it also was a product of a long-term association at Columbia with the famous author of Orientalism, that's the late Edward Said. And the prominent member of the so-called MELOC faculty, who has become controversial over the past decade at Columbia, is Joseph Massad. What's interesting about both of them is they're both Christians. Massad is from Jordan, and Edward Said calls himself a Palestinian and may have had a family background in Jerusalem, but really came from Egypt. And that the other point I want to make here is that the immediate past president at Columbia, who came from the University of Michigan Law School, Lee Bollinger by name, came in at virtually the same time as Professor Khalidi. Khalidi, by the way, was brought to Columbia underneath a $4 million endowment that came from certain U.S. trusts and from one of the Saudi oil companies. He also was co-founder of the Palestinian National Council, a member of which was the late Edward Said. So there they were in March of this year, hosting a retirement ceremony for Khalid. Virtually the same time, the two culprits of these campus events all across the United States, triggered by what happened at Columbia. That means Students for Justice in Palestine and something called Jewish Voices for Peace, or hardly peace, given their demonstrations I have witnessed over the past nearly 20 years on college campuses in the Northeast and elsewhere. They were suspended by Columbia as chapters at that time. And they retained the New York chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union to defend them on the grounds of, guess what? Free speech. And that is tantamount to asking a question: what is going on in academia today that allows benighted youth, students, to basically exercise protests without any critical thinking of what they're doing? And it really says a lot about the absence of the bedrocks of what you used to call liberal values that you were assigned as essential conditions for you to emerge from a university as an intelligent, educated human being who could reason. That's not happening anymore.
It turns reason itself on its head when you realize that what these protesters are doing is fighting against freedom of speech, fighting against liberal values. Thank you for that useful and fascinating introduction to our discussion. And I have some questions, if I may,
Sure.
pose to you that I think some of them will touch on some of the topics you've already discussed. But I think it's important to drill down into some of these questions, and I appreciate your willingness to address them. What are the major demands of the campus pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas protesters? What do they really want?
Well, they're talking about ceasefire now, but they're really talking about the elimination, extermination, if you will, extirpation of Israel as a Jewish state. That's what's behind their chant of free Palestine from the river to the sea. Then they wanted to divest investments from university endowments. And quite frankly, that's more difficult, particularly at major private institutions, than the press has let on, with some exceptions. And there are two glaring examples of basically universities acceding to those demands. One of them is Northwestern University, that has come to the fore because of cutting a deal with the leaders of the and the other is Brown University in Rhode Island, that basically has cut a very narrow deal to, quote, eliminate something in the order of about 11 identified Israeli companies that is being put up for a vote, I think, this fall before the corporate board for Brown University. That is essentially something that can't be done. These demands are not new demands. In fact, the boycott divestment movement that was established out of Israel by an Israeli Arab, I might add, fundamentally has been after doing this across the globe with virtually no success. Now it's apparent to a lot of people that some leaders at universities, including the president of Columbia and her announcement inviting the New York Police Department to come in, is they weren't going to divest from Israel, period. That is something that is a reality. And the reality is university endowments are there to provide some income growth. They've invested in hedge funds and index funds and other media, so to speak. And the reality is it is going to be extremely difficult to find socially responsible investments as alternatives to do that. They're also tagging a whole bunch of US companies that are suppliers of equipment and arms to Israel. General Dynamics, of course, is one. Boeing is another I could name. And Caterpillar. Why Caterpillar? Because those heavy tractors you see that are armored down in Gaza are made by Caterpillar.
And of course, these are the defense companies, US
Yes.
defense companies, but then there's Google, which has a multiple numbers of contracts with Israeli businesses and government. And you're quite correct to emphasize the infeasibility of divestment from Israeli firms and Israeli government contracts. It's simply too big to fail, as they say,
Yes.
the banking industry.
Right.
who are the major targets of the campus and street protests? Are there specific individuals that they want
Well,
to?
I mean, clearly at the top of the list is Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, for one. So is the so-called war minister, that's Mr. Gallant, and the IDF commanders.
Why did the protests seem to predominantly occur on private campuses?
Why in private universities? Because I think they have been the flagships of U.S. academic excellence here in the United States. But in fact, over the course, as we just talked about it, they have failed in many instances of providing a decent, well-grounded liberal education to send off people who are capable of becoming ultimate leaders. If you can't critically examine an issue and parse it and come up with the truth in it, then how can you lead any entity, whether it's a nonprofit or a business enterprise, in many ways? I might cite a couple of people who have different aspects as university leaders. One of the more impressive ones to me are Ben Sasse, the former U.S. Senator who is president of Florida University. Even before Governor DeSantis set up a ruling forcing the Justice for Palestine chapters out of Florida, Sasse put out a statement indicating what he considers as almost like a code that you had to follow if you wanted not to be suspended or basically asked to leave the university premises in that regard. So Sasse is kind of a hero in that regard. The other person who is akin to that is the German-American chancellor at Vanderbilt. His name is Daniel Diermeier. He may have one difference, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. He experienced in early April the invasion of a building under construction that was adjacent to his office in Nashville. And they had identified, after seizing back control, all of the individuals who were in there, both those who were outsiders and those who were students. He had no compunction about arresting them for criminal trespass. Now, his mantra is he wants to prevent the politicization of college campuses, which is in fact what has occurred. There's one area where I have a disagreement with him, and that took place yesterday in Washington, D.C., when the House passed on an overpowering majority basis, both Republicans and Democrats, for what is called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, the AAA, as it's called. Why? Because it codifies the International Holocaust Remembrance Act, the model that a number of states in the U.S. have adapted, but not all of them. And there are elements of the AAA, NEIHRA, as it's called, that the civil liberties groups cannot deal with as an impingement of their civil rights. One of them is criticism of Israel, because Israel is, for all intents and purposes, notwithstanding the ACLU's opposition, that is essentially the equivalent of the world Jew. It is, after all, a Jewish state, a tolerant, democratic Jewish state that doesn't essentially extirpate its minorities. And the other is just thinking about it, the casualties in Gaza and the untruths behind it. Compare that with the 300,000 Syrians who were murdered by guess who? Assad, in the wake of, quote, the uprising there, the virtual leveling of the city of Apollo. And you therefore come back to the question of what has to be done by leaders. Now, the one thing that has been a vast improvement over what occurred to at Brandeis University in 2007, when the Jordanian crown prince was invited, and there was a big uprising against Hirsi Ali herself, somebody who had been a courageous individual, not only in Holland, where she resided as a politician ultimately, but also here in the United States. She was supposed to receive an honor, but at that point in time, the students rose up against the university president, Fred Lawrence, and said, we don't want to award her anything. It was a total outrage. So the new administration at Brandeis last year resolved to say, you can't form a chapter of Justices for Palestine here. So it took that leadership. It took well over how many years? Sometimes 17 years for the complete turnaround at Brandeis to do that. So who else is being pillared by these groups? They don't like Joe Biden mealy-mouthing his lack of support for them while engaging in humanitarian declarations for the benefit of the population in Gaza. And they also don't like Blinken as well. So you have to ask yourself, who do they like? They certainly like Hamas.
Yes.
They don't care about those Jews, 1,200, actually more like 1,500 were killed. And if you wanted to toss in the IDF, the number gets even larger, doesn't it?
260 IDF soldiers have been killed since.
And something like about close to 4,000 injured, number of them seriously.
And over 100,000 displaced from their homes.
Correct.
It's been quite the cost in Israel.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
the international community is almost silent on that.
It's woefully silent in that regard.
Yeah.
And that's the reason we have fielded the programs we have over now nearly 6 months, including this one. But let's press on. Go ahead.
Okay. What's the history of Columbia University that became the epicenter of the U.S. and international campus protests?
Well, we talked earlier about what the university had spawned. They appointed Edward Said to the comparative literature faculty, as it turned out. And he's an interesting guy. He's a guy who, in 2000, went to the Blue Line. This was after Israel had finally evacuated from southern Lebanon. And what does he and his son do? They toss rocks across the border into Israel. Within probably about 75 meters of the Israeli outpost. It was a useless episode in his life. But it was picked up by Commentary magazine. And he now earned the sobriquet of being the professor of terror in that regard. But he had rather strange beliefs about, yes, the Jews may have had some support for their rights to the Holy Land, but so do the Palestinians. And of course, the problem is, who are the Palestinians? Who are they? Were they brought there because of the success of the early returning Jewish settlers in the 19th, early 20th century about making things bloom there? And they needed workers from different Arab countries. And you could tell that by the dialects that those groups speak in the clans that were formed. But the other aspect of Columbia is an enormous control over programs of the faculty senate, which, by the way, for your viewers, is a common problem across American academia. That essentially you would think the president and the administrative staff have certain controls. The reality is they don't in terms of handling faculty appointments for various programs. And that happened at Columbia, as witnessed by the recruiting of Professor Khalidi and Joseph Massad and several others. The one event that I can testify on, because I've written about it extensively, was what happened in 2007. 2007, a cabal, a pro-Islamic regime, professors and supporters were able to issue an invitation to Iranian President Ahmadinejad to appear. I was there when that happened in Lerner Hall, and it was kind of a bizarre experience, because before he said something to the assembled crowd, he said several prayers for the conversion of the audience to Islam. It was just completely nuts in that regard. But it was indicative of the laissez-faire, freedom of speech, freedom of thought attitude that former President Lee Bollinger had come in with from his former post as dean of the Michigan Law School. And when he retired, interesting, Khalidi retires in 2023, right? Just before this thing. And so does Lee Bollinger. And where does Lee Bollinger end up? Over at Columbia Law School as the Seth Low professor in charge of, guess what? First Amendment and free speech rights. That tells you in a nutshell what went on there. But Columbia has had a long history of protests. We'll get to that in the context of another question you're going to pose.
Okay. What have been the historical precedents for these street and campus protests?
Well, that's very interesting. In 1968, it was the whole series of Vietnam War protests. And again, at Columbia, and I was nearby in a research institute, they took over Hamilton Hall, detained one of the administrators, and finally, not unlike what happened on May Day, early May Day of 2024, essentially the New York PD came in and basically released the hostage and basically arrested or scattered the perpetrators of the takeover. Now, one of them was an interesting character. He was a math student at Columbia. His name was Mark Rudd, and he escaped. He escaped from clutches of being arrested by the New York PD. Gene and I were stunned one morning when we were living out in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which we had a habit of doing in the summertime for several weeks, when it was revealed that Mark Rudd was essentially a junior high school teacher in Albuquerque.
Yeah.
So that was one thing. And the other precedent that followed that were all of the series of protests on campuses about divestment from South Africa. And we had another event at Columbia at that point in time. But this was all throughout the US. And of course, that didn't end until the Kent State Massacre, as it was called, in 1970 in Ohio, when the National Guard broke into that episode, and unfortunately 4 kids on campus were killed. So those are the kind of historical precedents that we have in terms of campus activism.
What international effects are these protests having?
Well, it's interesting to me, the protests occurred largely isolated, but in predominantly Muslim minority countries. And I'll give you a case in point. The UK. The UK has had all kinds of protests since October 7th, mainly aimed at Israel, but also the local Jewish population in the UK. Just yesterday, we had riots in Lyon, in France, essentially about the same issue. And curiously enough, the only place in the Middle East on a collegiate campus was the American University in Beirut. That was the only one. And this is totally unlike, by comparison, something else I lived through in 2006, the Danish cartoons episode, which went global, I mean global, in the Muslim world at that point in time. And what that augurs well for is that if indeed normalization with Saudi Arabia occurs, along with what has occurred in the Emirates, save for Qatar, basically it means that the Arab Sunni world knows essentially who are its supporters in the West, in the context of opposing the real enemy in the Middle East, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran at this point in time. But that appears to be the pattern that's emerged over the course of these last few months.
What is behind these campus protests? Who are behind it? Who's behind it? Who's funding these campus protests? They're expensive.
Oh, they are. Well, as it turns out, it's the combination. They're almost in lockstep with each other. Is the Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voices for Peace, and something called Empower, Muslim Power, that a gal who resides in Brooklyn, but who supports Hamas, has organized. And who's funding it? I'll tell you, it's kind of a shocker. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, got that. George Soros's Open Society, and something called the Tides Foundation have been funding programs for these cadres to engage in this kind of activity. That's for openers. Then in the case of the interesting thing is the Justice for Students in Palestine is connected with another group that is a 501c3, and that's the American Muslim Association, which has connections with Muslim Brotherhood. You could also toss in there the Council for American Islamic Relations, because the leaders of that are all declared Muslim Brotherhood supporters.
What you mentioned a couple of other countries that have seen similar protests, such as the UK and France. Are there any other countries that these protests have erupted in? And are there street protests in Israel?
Well, we know, let's take Israel first. We've got street protests for the groups that want to bring home the hostages that have stopped traffic, essentially tried to encircle the Knesset, protested before President Netanyahu's home, and blocked highways. It's not unlike what happened, for example, here in the United States, when these same groups shut down the Golden Gate Bridge passage, as I recall. And they've done some of that stuff elsewhere in this country as well to try and force the issue out. You've got protests certainly in London and other major UK cities tied to the very same groups that have supported Hamas and what I call Islamic extremism over the past couple of decades. Gordon Murray, who's a big supporter of Israel, has written extensively about that in the past, including a book indicating that that was the future that Europe faces in the space of the next decade or so. That is the demographic changes that occurred there. So always interesting to me to know that because following World War II, maybe even prior to it, England established the British Commonwealth that included a number of countries that subsequently became independent. But the citizens of those countries were eligible for getting entry notifications and ultimately British passports. And that's how Britain ends up with a significant Muslim minority that has been problematic. And it has been at the forefront of these protests. And in France's case, same situation. Its former colonies, particularly in North Africa, became the mass movement after World War II to essentially become a significant problem. We saw that in the murders of Jews, essentially in those banlieues, the suburbs around Paris and other major cities. My friend Nidra Poller has written about that for years. I've interviewed her extensively about that. So France is a problem. Disturbingly, so is Sweden. Sweden adopted a liberal immigration policy, and it has led to an influx of elements of its Muslim citizens who basically have evidence extreme anti-Semitism there. To a certain degree, you have the same problem in Germany. Witness the significant Turkish population there. Witness the attempts by the Islamic regime to assassinate Iranian defectors in that location. And you have a similar thing, but in a shorter, smaller fashion, essentially in neighboring Austria. Italy is not exempt from that because of the influx of immigrants from across the Mediterranean. It has not gotten significant control over that, and neither has Greece. So there's a host of countries that have been impacted by the effects of the Arab Revolution, the 2011 episode, and Assad forcing out 5 to 7 million refugees into neighboring Turkey, and then across the Mediterranean, obviously, into Europe. And what was not lost on me was that Europe has not abandoned the so-called Schengen boundaryless system of the EU. You've got a few far-right prime ministers, particularly the woman in Italy, certainly the regimes in Slovakia, and certainly Viktor Orban in Hungary, who have railed against that stuff. even a person I call friend is Geert Wilders, who may or may not become the next prime minister in Holland if he ever gets his negotiations with a number of parties to essentially take over the position. But that seems to be the problem, was once you open up the door to a different ideology, you don't get anywhere. There was an interesting essay I read this past week that basically talked about the problem of European, or what my friend Giselle Littman, Bat Yor used to call Eurabia. How did you get this Euro-Arabian connection that allowed those elements to get in? And that's the heritage of being so benighted, not realizing that the seeds were being sown essentially for the demise of Europe. That is essentially, I believe, what is the implication of the book that Gordon Murray wrote about.
And that Geert Wilders has so openly spoken about.
Yep.
And why he is being resisted by so many progressives in the Netherlands who become the prime minister, despite his party's victory in the last election.
I was involved in 2009 talking about my Alumnus institution at Columbia, of getting him there through an arduous process of clearances with the public safety commander for Columbia University. And you'll get this as being kind of funny. We got the sponsorship of what was left at that time in 2009 of young Republicans. But we did it. And we're proud we did, in the sense of getting somebody to communicate the realities of what was going on. None of that, but a good friend of Israel to begin with, by virtue of his youth spent for a couple of summers on a moshav there. He knows what it's about.
He knows Israel.
Oh, yeah.
How have the protests specifically targeted Jewish students and faculty?
Well, I think it's illustrated by the appearance of not only Ilhan Omar at Columbia, but when on April the 19th, the New York PD came in and they arrested a whole bunch of the protesters, and among them was her daughter, who was a student at Barnard. She may be suspended or whatever as a result of the arrest that occurred. But the skein of hate shown to Jewish kids on campuses, Columbia is one of them, by the protesters, by simply inferring that they were perpetrators of a genocide, the very words and definitions of which were essentially what occurred to their relatives, forebears, essentially during World War II, in Hitler's final solution, is just despicable and frightening. There was a survey that was done by University of Chicago professor. He did it through the aegis of NORC, NORC, as a polling organization. They polled something in the order of 5,000, a sample of 5,000 across nearly 500 universities. And some of the findings out of that are kind of interesting. One of the findings was that 58% of the Jewish students feared for safety after the October 7th pogrom. allegedly 52% of the Muslims feared what they call Islamophobia. But the more troubling thing is that 10% of the students would permit calls for genocide, what we were just talking about, against Jews, which is horrific. And 13% said they deserved it when attacked. By the Haruk, the Hamas version of the Nazi SS, Waffen, or whatever you want to call them in that regard. But that's some of the disturbing elements that percolated through this whole episode.
Have any of these anti-Semitic threats resulted in physical violence?
Well, I think you've got the example of what occurred in UCLA in the early morning of May Day. There were students who were essentially Jewish students who were attacked, but so were the perpetrators. I
think threats are themselves violent. I think you'd agree. If you can make a threat against anyone that is backed up by what is apparent force, you've hurt them. And I think even those threats that haven't specifically resulted in violence are themselves violent. And it's a pretty bleak story. And we're all shocked by what is going on some of our most important academic institutions. But have there been any successes that we can talk about? You mentioned Ben Sasse at the University of Florida. You mentioned Dirkmeyer at Vanderbilt. What has been their technique? How have they been successful in curbing campus? And let's talk about municipal disorder. Have there been any successful mayors, for example, or governors who have taken successful action to curb this disorder and these threats?
Well, clearly in Florida's case, it was DeSantis who stepped up to the plate in the context of getting a ban against SJP, the Students for Justice in Palestine. Derriman, who we spoke of earlier, is primarily focused on eliminating politicization. He's also not a supporter of divestment, obviously. But he's primarily focused on coming up with what you and I, because of our common military background, would be a code of conduct on campus. And if you don't behave in accordance with the code, then you get penalized by it. You get shown a door if you are engaged in destroying property or committing criminal trespass, because you can be convicted for that. So those are some examples. I guess the president of Indiana University, who called in the cops, did a pretty efficient job with minimal damage in that instance. But I can't say that for the vast majority of these institutions. The gal who's the current president of Columbia, who's testified before Congress, had established an anti-Semitism task force with some alumni and others. And she was hired, I think, by the Board of Trustees at Columbia because she had a track record of dealing with very difficult problems, both in Europe and here. And when she came out and said unequivocally, no, we're not going to divest from Israel, that was a good thing. Could she have acted earlier? I think so, but what she had tried to do was go negotiate with these people and find out it was non-negotiable. And she was also up against, frankly, timing. In Columbia's case, it's got a commencement coming up on, what is it, May 15th. And they have final exam periods between the 5th and the 10th on the campus there. So they wanted to clear out that stuff to make ready. As it is, I think the Morningside Heights campus is going to be basically completely cordoned off with complete security, meaning tickets for parents coming in to see their child, son or daughter graduate from whatever level, undergraduate or the various graduate schools there. But she did it in the nick of time. The press conference yesterday with the New York mayor, it's kind of interesting because what they were identifying were the presence of outside influences, call them agent provocateurs, essentially who were perpetrating that, as well as what happened at the City University of New York, which is just down the road from Columbia. And I think that was to his group's stead. One of the things I saw yesterday was areas in the roadways, Broadway, all the way up through Morningside Heights, completely cordoned off. There wasn't one piece of mobile transport up there. No cars. And I think that's what they're going to try and do again during commencement on the 15th. But I think what may happen in the wake of this current round is something that you and I remember occurred back in 1968. And that is that all of these Islamist proponents are going to converge on, guess what? And it's ironic, the Democratic Convention in Chicago this year. Because they see blood in how the Biden administration is handling the situation in Gaza. At the one time saying nice words about supporting Israel, but in the reality trying to handcuff its sovereignty and cutting a deal. And saying enough is enough. We can't negotiate with an opponent who doesn't want to negotiate, period. And which is, of course, what's happened over the last nearly 2 months in Gaza.
Well, it's coming to a head, I think.
Yes.
We shall see probably very soon how that will turn out.
Right.
And it really, we touched on this tangentially, and we talked about this before. Hamas knows exactly what they're doing, and they are using the population of Gaza as one giant 2 million strong human shield. They don't care about the lives of the people who live in Gaza. They only care about their own survival, their own victory, and everybody else is dismissible. You know, it's interesting. We've talked about successes in confronting this disorder and these threats. And because of my own familiarity with the University of Florida, I remember the first weekend, October 7th, was it was Shabbat.
Yep.
And the first weekend, it was the first weekend of this current war. And some pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian demonstrators threatened Jewish students on the University of Florida campus, specifically Hillel, which is the Jewish student organization on campus, which is very close to the campus, to the chancellor's residence, to President Sass's office areas. And Sass said immediately, he didn't wait, that day, he came out with instructions for campus police, which do have a strong presence on the University of Florida campus, which I know, I've seen that. A great relationship with the city police department. Don't allow these people back on campus. They can't function here. All the protesters had to be taken off campus and they were gone the first weekend. So part of that was fortuitous in the sense that the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas demonstrators acted very quickly after the initial attack in Israel, and they made a mistake of going after Jewish students at the University of Florida, and SAS made a very decisive statement, and he stuck by it. So University of Florida, they don't have a problem because the SAS took decisive action early. I think I think you'd agree, the longer you let this fester, the only worse it's going to get. And we see it metastasizes, it breeds, it produces its own dynamic, and it goes after weakness. So where campus administrators are weak, they're going to have more problems.
Absolutely.
We talked about the feasibility of divestment and how difficult that would be even if there was a decision to divest. Any final thoughts on divestment as a goal? I mean, I know you're the vice president of an organization which is against divestment. What's a successful strategy moving forward to prevent divestment and maybe more broadly actions addressed against Israel?
Well, there are several. One is obviously an initiative that was set up almost a decade ago, which is to enable state level legislation that would prevent divestment of Israel interests, so to speak, in the portfolios of some of the universities. Not the universities, but in state retirement systems. Get that?
Yes.
Yeah. And state retirement systems, from my own investment banking experience, were amongst the first to step up into the hedge fund investment options for doing that. So the more that legislation has been enabled across the U.S. was a method of getting back at the whole question of BDS. And that, I believe, has had a dampening effect on some of that, but it hasn't exactly cut it off completely. And second thing we talked about earlier is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Now that's important because that act would enable the U.S. Department of Education, as a case in point, to use it in conducting what are called Title VI of the Civil Rights Law, to investigate discriminatory actions towards individuals by virtue of their race and religion. And it has been used as a way to investigate some of the activities we've seen on college campuses. That is, in fact, going on as we speak. So there has been some things at both the federal level as well as at state level that have blunted the question of divestment from Israel, but also protection, essentially, of Jewish student interests on campuses. And I think it's emboldened by the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that was passed yesterday.
Yeah. Well, it's all we can do, I think, is continue to observe critically what is happening, draw lessons for how to successfully confront the disorder and the hatred, and frankly, pray for Israel, for the homeland of the Jewish people in their current situation. I certainly do every day. I know you do too. We wish for the success of the IDF and their fight against Hamas. We want the hostages to return home safely. We'd like for our government and our institutions to do everything they can to confront anti-Semitism wherever it is found. Jerry, it's been an honor, a privilege to speak with you today. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. I look forward to future discussions. This one was a particularly wide-ranging one. Thank you again.
And I thank you for being the interviewer, which is the contrast of what we usually do on this stuff. But I think it was timely, and by witness of the fact that we're talking about events that happen within a period of less than 12 hours.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.